They called it the House of Freedom, a shining white palace where presidents would one day swear sacred oaths beneath a bright American sky, a place celebrated as the symbol of liberty, democracy, and hope. But long before its white walls reflected the morning sun, they reflected something else: sweat, blood, whips, chains dragging across raw earth. Before the White House belonged to presidents, it belonged to men who would never sleep inside its walls, men whose names were never carved into its foundation, women whose tears vanished into the mud before sunrise, children who carried stones too heavy for their small hands. The greatest symbol of American freedom was raised by people who possessed none. That truth remained buried beneath polished marble and patriotic speeches for generations. Yet if those walls could speak, they would tell a very different story. The year was 1792. The American Revolution had ended less than a decade earlier. Britain was gone. Independence had been won. Across the 13 former colonies, people celebrated the birth of a new republic unlike anything the world had ever seen. Newspapers praised liberty. Politicians praised equality. Church bells rang across cities as citizens dreamed of a government built on the rights of mankind. But only a few miles from those celebrations, another America quietly continued. Auction blocks still stood in public squares. Iron shackles still clamped around wrists. Slave ships still unloaded human beings whose names had been stolen somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean. Freedom had arrived, just not for everyone. The nation's leaders now faced a different challenge. They needed a permanent capital worthy of their new country. Philadelphia had served temporarily. New York had hosted the first government, but neither city would become the lasting heart of America. President George Washington imagined something greater. A magnificent federal city rising beside the Potomac River, wide avenues, grand buildings, monuments that would outlive generations. At its center would stand the president's house. No one yet called it the White House. It was simply meant to become the home of America's elected leader. Architects from Europe submitted elegant designs. After fierce competition, an Irish-born architect named James Hoban won. His vision was magnificent. Tall columns, graceful symmetry, walls built from pale sandstone. It would rival the finest palaces in Europe while representing a republic instead of a monarchy. The design inspired excitement. The construction inspired something else. A desperate question: who would actually build it? Washington City barely existed. The land was little more than forests, marshes, rolling hills, and muddy roads. There were not enough skilled laborers. European immigrants were too few. Paid workers demanded wages the young government struggled to afford. Construction deadlines approached. Congress expected progress. Then officials reached for the solution already surrounding them: slavery. Almost overnight, commissioners began contacting plantation owners across Maryland and Virginia. Requests became contracts. Contracts became shipments. Dozens, then hundreds of enslaved African Americans were forced toward the future capital, not as citizens, not as workers, as property, Receipts listed them beside horses, wagons, and tools. Names were often replaced with numbers. A plantation owner might send 6 men for several months. Another rented 8. Another supplied teenage boys strong enough to carry stone. Government records carefully documented the payments. The money never reached the laborers themselves. It went directly into the pockets of the people who claimed ownership over them. Thus began one of America's greatest contradictions. The government created to defend liberty was paying slave owners to provide enslaved labor. No speeches mentioned this. No celebrations acknowledged it. History would remain strangely silent for centuries. As dawn broke over the Potomac each morning, long lines of enslaved workers marched toward construction sites. Fog drifted above the river. Axes echoed through untouched forests. Massive oak trees crashed into the earth one after another. The first task was not building. It was clearing an entire wilderness. Mosquitoes swarmed around wetlands. Summer heat wrapped itself around everybody tapada like a heavy blanket. Winter winds sliced through thin clothing. Still, the work never stopped. Trees became timber. Earth became roads. Swamps slowly transformed into the beginnings of a capital city. Among those laborers was a young man historians know only by fragments. His full story disappeared with time. Records identify him simply as Ben, no surname, no birthday, no photograph, only scattered government documents proving he existed. Ben rose before sunrise every morning. An overseer's voice replaced any alarm clock. Breakfast, when available, consisted of coarse cornmeal and salted meat. Then came the march. Chains did not always connect every worker, but invisible chains surrounded all of them. None could leave. None chose to be there. Escape meant dogs, punishment, or death. Ben's hands soon hardened into rough leather. Splinters buried themselves beneath broken fingernails. Every evening, his shoulders burned from lifting timber that would one day support ceilings admired by presidents and foreign kings. He would never stand beneath those finished rooms. He was building a home forbidden to him forever. Nearby worked another enslaved laborer called Peter. Unlike Ben, Peter possessed remarkable skill with stone. He had learned masonry through years of forced labor on plantations. Now government superzosas relied his acquaintrius. Huge sandstone blocks arrived from quarries at Aquia Creek in Virginia. Each stone weighed hundreds of pounds. Workers loaded them onto barges floating down rivers before hauling them again across muddy roads. Peter shaped rough stone into smooth perfection. Every strike of his hammer demanded incredible precision. One mistake ruined weeks of work. Yet no newspaper praised Peter's craftsmanship. No architect invited him to stand proudly beside completed walls. The building would bear someone else's name, always someone else's name. As construction advanced, more enslaved craftsmen arrived. Carpenters, brickmakers, sawyers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights. Many possessed extraordinary talents developed over years of unpaid labor. Ironically, some became more skilled than the white supervisors directing them. Still, talent changed nothing. A slave remained a slave. Government payroll records listed expenses with remarkable precision. Payments for nails, payments for stone, payments for lumber, payments sent to slave owners renting out enslaved workers. The documents survived. The workers' voices did not. Night after night, crude camps formed around the construction grounds. Small fires flickered against darkness. Exhausted bodies rested upon rough blankets. Some whispered memories of families waiting on distant plantations. Others quietly sang spiritual songs carried across generations from Africa. Their music drifted upward beneath stars, shining over a nation promising freedom. Hope and heartbreak shared the same sky. One elderly laborer often stared toward the unfinished mansion before sleeping. Nobody knows his real name. One witness remembered only that he spoke very little. Perhaps silence had become safer than words. Perhaps grief had exhausted every sentence inside him. Or perhaps he wondered whether future generations would ever know who truly built those rising walls. If he wondered, history would prove his fears justified. Months became years. The sandstone walls climbed higher. Columns took shape. Roof beams stretched across the growing structure. Visitors arrived to admire the astonishing progress. Politicians smiled. Architects accepted praise. George Washington himself inspected construction several times, eager to witness the birth of his presidential residence. Crowds admired the beauty. Almost no one noticed the exhausted black workers disappearing into the background whenever important guests arrived. It was as though the builders themselves had become invisible. Invisible hands, invisible suffering, invisible history. But beneath the elegant architecture, something darker continued unfolding. The labor required even greater sacrifice as the building entered its most dangerous phase. Falls from towering scaffolds became common. Massive stones slipped without warning. Heavy beams crushed limbs in an instant. Medical care barely existed. If an enslaved worker died, another quickly replaced him. No memorial marked the place. No newspaper printed an obituary. Only the construction continued, faster, higher, relentlessly. And before long, one terrible accident would reveal just how little an enslaved life was worth to the people creating America's greatest symbol of freedom. The cry echoed across the construction grounds before the stone even struck the earth. Men dropped their tools. Hammers fell silent. For a brief moment, the constant rhythm of chisels and saws disappeared beneath a single terrible sound. One of the massive sandstone blocks had slipped from its ropes. It crashed through the wooden scaffolding, sending splinters flying into the morning air. Dust swallowed everything. Workers ran toward the wreckage, but they already knew what they would find. An enslaved laborer lay beneath the shattered timbers. No official record carefully described his final moments. His name, if anyone wrote it down, has long since disappeared. The government accounts continued recording deliveries of stone and payments to slave owners, yet the life crushed beneath that stone became little more than another forgotten cost of construction. The building continued to rise. That was all that seemed to matter. The overseers ordered the surviving men back to work before the dust had completely settled. Fear spread quietly through the camp that evening. Every man understood that tomorrow it could be his body beneath the stones, his life erased without ceremony, his family never even learning where he had died. Yet no one stopped working because they could not. Every sunrise brought another impossible task. The forests surrounding the growing capital slowly disappeared. Entire hillsides were carved away to make room for roads, government buildings, and public squares. The dream of a magnificent capital demanded endless labor, and enslaved Africans became the invisible force driving that dream forward. Some spent their days cutting enormous trees into beams. Others hauled brick after brick beneath the burning summer sun. Blacksmiths forged iron hinges, nails, and tools inside furnaces so hot that breathing itself became painful. Sparks flew like fireflies as sweat poured down faces already covered in soot. Carpenters shaped elegant window frames with remarkable precision. Their skilled hands created beauty they would never be allowed to enjoy. Every polished doorway, every staircase, every carefully fitted beam carried traces of Hand's history almost erased. Among these craftsmen was an enslaved carpenter known in surviving documents simply as Isaac. Unlike many laborers, Isaac had spent years mastering woodworking. Plantation owners often recognized that skilled slaves earned more money than field workers, renting them out to wealthy clients for difficult construction projects. Isaac understood wood the way a musician understands an instrument. He could study the grain of an oak beam and know exactly where to cut. He crafted doors so perfectly balanced they seemed almost weightless despite their size. Government officials admired the quality of the finished work. Few ever wondered who had actually built it. As each room inside the president's house took shape, Isaac quietly moved from one chamber to another, fitting ceilings, trimming windows, and smoothing polished floors. Perhaps he imagined what life inside these walls would someday look like. Elegant dinners, political debates, foreign ambassadors, music echoing through candle-lit halls. But he knew one painful truth. No matter how beautiful the house became, it would never welcome him as a free man. Far from the mansion itself, another group of enslaved workers faced an equally exhausting burden. The sandstone used for the White House did not appear magically on the construction site. It came from Aquia Creek, nearly 40 miles away in Virginia. There, enslaved quarrymen spent endless days cutting enormous blocks from solid rock. The work demanded incredible strength. Iron wedges split stone apart. Heavy mallets echoed through the quarry from sunrise until darkness. Clouds of pale, dust-covered skin entered lungs and settled into every wound. After cutting the stone, workers dragged the blocks onto crude wagons before loading them onto barges floating toward Washington. Each journey carried enormous danger. Storms could overturn the barges. Ropes snapped without warning. Crushing injuries became common. Still, the shipments continued because the White House could not wait. As construction advanced, Washington City itself slowly emerged from wilderness. Roads stretched between muddy hills. Government offices appeared beside unfinished streets. Workers built bridges across streams that had once divided forests. The city looked less like a frontier settlement and more like the future capital of a growing nation. Visitors praised its rapid transformation. They admired the ambition of America's founders. Many spoke proudly of building a republic unlike any empire before it. Yet, just beyond the public celebrations stood lines of enslaved men carrying stone beneath armed supervision. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. A nation declaring that all men are created equal depended heavily upon people legally denied even the most basic rights. Some leaders recognized the contradiction. Very few challenged it. George Washington himself lived with this contradiction every day. He often visited Mount Vernon, where hundreds of enslaved people worked his plantation. As president, he oversaw the creation of a government built upon liberty while personally benefiting from slavery. Historians continue debating his private thoughts. He expressed discomfort with slavery later in life. He eventually arranged for some enslaved